In April 2025, a single Royal Guard's decision changed the course of an international scandal. Thomas stood motionless at his post outside Buckingham Palace, his red uniform pristine as always, when J.D. Vance's team approached him with an offer that would change everything. They thought his silence meant compliance, that his loyalty could be bought with promises of serving his country in new ways. They thought his silence meant compliance. What he did instead would ripple through Buckingham Palace and Washington. What happened next exposed secret diplomatic dealings that triggered an investigation and earned Thomas a title few will ever know: the Guard who saved the gate. But to understand how one man's choice could shake two governments, you need to know what made Thomas different from any other guard who had ever worn that uniform. Before we dive in, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more power stories, and let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to hear. Most men his age spent their mornings rushing through London's crowded streets, clutching coffee and checking phones, but Thomas began each day at 4:30 with the same ritual he had followed for 8 years. By 6:15, he stood at his assigned post outside Buckingham Palace, as motionless as the iron railings beside him, while tourists began their daily pilgrimage to witness something they could never truly understand. The discipline required for this role went far beyond standing still. Thomas had learned this truth during his first week when a fellow guard collapsed from heat exhaustion after breaking protocol to wipe sweat from his brow. The Queen's Guard represented more than ceremonial duty. They embodied centuries of unwavering service to the crown. And Thomas carried that weight with the same seriousness he had once carried his rifle through the mountains of Afghanistan. 2 tours in Helmand province had taught him that survival often depended on appearing calm while your mind processed every threat, every movement, every sound that might signal danger. His military training served him well in ways visitors never suspected. While tourists saw an immobile figure in an ornate uniform, Thomas cataloged every face, every bag, every unusual behavior in his peripheral vision. The woman who returned 3 days running photographing security cameras and asking questions about guard rotations. The diplomatic car that arrived 15 minutes early with passengers who seemed more interested in the palace layout than their scheduled meeting. His eyes remained fixed forward, but his awareness extended in all directions, processing information with the methodical precision of a soldier who had learned that details saved lives. The respect Thomas commanded among his fellow guards came not from his military decorations, though those spoke volumes, but from his absolute reliability. In 8 years, he had never missed a shift, never broken character, never given tourists the reaction they desperately sought with their jokes and provocations. When new recruits joined the regiment, they studied Thomas as the standard they hoped to achieve, watching how he managed the constant pressure of public scrutiny while maintaining the dignity their position demanded. Palace staff trusted him with sensitive information about visitor schedules and security concerns because they knew his discretion was absolute. Thomas understood that his true responsibility extended far beyond protecting a building or even protecting the royal family. He guarded something intangible but infinitely valuable, the idea that some institutions remained above the chaos of modern politics, the belief that duty and honor still mattered in a world that increasingly questioned such concepts. Every morning when he took his post, he became part of an unbroken chain stretching back through centuries of British history, a living reminder that some things endured because people chose to make them endure, regardless of personal cost or public recognition. His fellow guards often wondered what drove Thomas to choose this life when his military record could have opened doors to lucrative private security positions or government roles that offered advancement and recognition. The answer lay in something he rarely discussed: his understanding that true service required sacrifice and that the most important victories often went unnoticed by those they protected. Afghanistan had shown him what happened when institutions failed, when corruption replaced duty, and when personal gain mattered more than collective responsibility. This combination of military training, ceremonial discipline, and moral conviction made Thomas uniquely suited for challenges that went far beyond his official duties. His superiors recognized this quality, though they rarely acknowledged it, directly trusting him with sensitive assignments that required both discretion and judgment. When foreign dignitaries visited the palace, Thomas often found himself positioned where his observational skills could provide valuable intelligence about potential security concerns or unusual behavior patterns among visiting delegations. As spring arrived in London, bringing longer days and larger crowds, Thomas maintained his routine with the same dedication he had shown throughout his service. But beneath his familiar exterior, something had begun to shift, a growing awareness that his years of quiet observation and unwavering loyalty were preparing him for a test unlike any he had faced. The skills that made him the perfect guardian would soon be challenged in ways that would force him to choose between competing definitions of duty and service. But none of his routines prepared him for the mission about to arrive. The black sedan pulled through the embassy gates on Grosvenor Square at precisely 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a passenger whose public schedule listed routine diplomatic meetings, but whose private agenda would threaten the foundation of British sovereignty. Senator J.D. Vance stepped onto London pavement with the confident stride of a man who believed destiny had chosen him to reshape the Western world. His official itinerary included tea with backbench MPs and a lecture at the Royal Institute. But these public appearances served merely as cover for meetings that would never appear in any diplomatic log. 3 weeks before his arrival, Vance's advance team had conducted what they called reconnaissance, but what intelligence professionals recognized as operational preparation. They photographed entry points and cataloged security rotations with the thoroughness of military planners preparing for invasion rather than diplomats arranging courtesy calls. The team leader carried credentials identifying him as a cultural attaché, but his background included 15 years with the Defense Intelligence Agency and expertise in what the intelligence community politely termed human asset development. British intelligence monitored all extended diplomatic visits, including Vance's. What MI5 analysts discovered during routine surveillance raised quiet concerns among security officials who noted that typical diplomatic visits required far less detailed operational information than the Americans were requesting. Vance's team had demanded unusually comprehensive data about guard rotations, visitor access procedures, and communication systems, claiming they needed thorough security assessments to protect their principal during ceremonial visits. Vance carried with him a vision that he believed would restore American greatness and British sovereignty simultaneously. He saw NATO as a relic that constrained both nations, preventing them from pursuing their natural interests in favor of multilateral compromise that served no one effectively. In private conversations with wealthy donors back home, he had argued that Britain remained America's most reliable ally, but that decades of European integration had weakened British resolve and diluted their commitment to the special relationship that had defined Anglo-American cooperation since Churchill and Roosevelt. The intelligence Vance sought went far beyond routine diplomatic information. His operatives wanted detailed knowledge of British defense communication systems, NATO information sharing protocols, and the specific procedures used to coordinate military responses during international crises. This information would allow him to understand exactly how Britain processed and shared intelligence with European partners, and where pressure points existed that might encourage British leaders to reconsider their multilateral commitments in favor of bilateral arrangements with Washington. His team had spent months identifying vulnerabilities within British institutions, focusing particularly on individuals whose background suggested they might be sympathetic to arguments about national sovereignty and military strength. They compiled detailed profiles of palace staff, military personnel, and civil servants, looking for people whose personal histories included service in Afghanistan or Iraq, conflicts where American and British forces had fought side by side and formed bonds that transcended official diplomatic channels. Intelligence analysts later discovered that Vance's team had conducted extensive research into Thomas's military service record, focusing particularly on his combat deployments and the commendations he had received for action supporting American forces during joint operations in Helmand Province. They believed his military background and demonstrated courage under fire made him an ideal candidate for recruitment, especially if they could frame their request as serving both British and American interests in maintaining strong defense cooperation between longtime allies. The senator's London schedule included private dinners with defense contractors who held significant influence over British military procurement decisions. These meetings aimed to identify business leaders who shared his vision of reduced European integration and increased Anglo-American cooperation in defense matters. Vance understood that economic relationships often drove political decisions and that British companies with substantial American contracts might prove willing to advocate for policy positions that strengthened bilateral ties at the expense of multilateral commitments. The secret mission that brought J.D. Vance to London in April 2025 involved nothing less than an attempt to fracture Britain's commitment to European integration and NATO cooperation by gathering intelligence that would allow him to pressure British leaders into prioritizing bilateral American relationships over multilateral European ones. He believed that demonstrating American access to British defense information would prove to voters back home that he possessed the international credibility necessary for higher office, while simultaneously weakening Britain's ties to continental Europe. But Vance's team underestimated the one guard whose loyalty could not be bought. They watched Thomas for 6 days before making their move, studying his routines with the patience of hunters tracking prey through familiar territory. The approach came during his Thursday afternoon break when he stepped away from his post for the regulation. 15 minutes allowed every 4 hours. A man in an expensive gray suit approached the small cafe where Thomas always ordered black coffee and a plain sandwich, positioning himself at the adjacent table with practiced casualness that spoke of extensive training in human intelligence operations. The stranger introduced himself as David Morrison, claiming to work for a Washington think tank focused on transatlantic security cooperation. He mentioned his own Navy background, serving aboard destroyers in the Persian Gulf, and praised Thomas for his service record, which he seemed to know in remarkable detail. Morrison's psychological approach revealed sophisticated understanding of military psychology and the particular pressures facing veterans who had transitioned to civilian roles. He spoke about the frustration many soldiers felt watching politicians make decisions that ignored hard-won lessons from the battlefield. He suggested that men like Thomas, who had demonstrated courage under fire, possessed insights that could help strengthen the alliance between Britain and America, if only there were channels for sharing such knowledge outside the constraints of traditional diplomatic bureaucracy. The conversation shifted gradually from general commentary about military service to specific praise for Thomas's role as a royal guard. Morrison expressed admiration for the discipline required to stand motionless for hours while remaining alert to potential threats. He suggested that this combination of patience and vigilance made palace guards uniquely qualified to observe patterns and behaviors that escape the notice of other security personnel. The flattery was expertly calibrated to appeal to professional pride while laying groundwork for more specific requests. 3 days later, Morrison returned with a more direct proposition framed as an opportunity to serve both countries simultaneously. He explained that certain American officials needed better understanding of British security procedures, not to exploit weaknesses, but to identify ways that American and British forces could coordinate more effectively during joint operations or emergency situations. He painted a picture of enhanced cooperation that would benefit both nations while strengthening the special relationship that had defined Anglo-American partnership since World War II. The specific requests began with seemingly innocuous information about visitor access procedures and guard rotation schedules. Morrison explained that American security officials needed to understand how British counterparts managed high-profile events and VIP visits to improve their own protective protocols. He suggested that sharing such information would demonstrate British expertise while helping American agencies adopt best practices developed through centuries of royal protection experience. The financial incentive came wrapped in language about consulting fees and recognition for expertise. Morrison offered Thomas £25,000 for what he called a comprehensive security assessment that would help American officials understand British approaches to institutional protection. But Thomas's military training had taught him to recognize intelligence-gathering operations, and Morrison's approach bore all the hallmarks of a recruitment attempt designed to develop a human asset within British government institutions. The flattery about his expertise and the emphasis on serving both countries represented classic manipulation techniques used to convince targets that betrayal served a higher purpose. Morrison's true objectives extended far beyond visitor procedures and guard rotations. The questions grew progressively more specific, focusing on communication systems used to coordinate emergency responses and the protocols governing information sharing between palace security and other government agencies. He wanted to understand how British officials processed intelligence from NATO partners and the specific procedures used to coordinate military responses during international crises. These details would allow American officials to understand pressure points within British decision-making processes. The pressure for immediate commitment intensified during their fourth meeting, when Morrison suggested that window for this cooperation might close soon due to changing political circumstances in Washington. He emphasized that officials who had authorized this outreach might not remain in positions to pursue such arrangements indefinitely. The implied urgency was designed to prevent Thomas from seeking guidance or reporting the contact to his superiors. But behind his still facade, alarm bells started ringing. Morrison's confidence in his approach reflected fundamental misunderstanding of the man he was attempting to recruit. The American operative saw Thomas's silence as indication of serious consideration rather than recognition of the true nature of their conversations. He believed that appeals to patriotism combined with financial incentives would eventually overcome any reluctance to share information that could strengthen transatlantic cooperation. Thomas had never intended to comply with their requests, but he recognized the importance of understanding the full scope of their operation before taking action that would expose their activities to British authorities. That evening, Morrison handed him an envelope containing what he called preliminary consultation materials. Thomas opened the envelope in his small flat that night and found documents outlining security procedures that any tourist could observe during public ceremonies. But their existence proved Morrison's team was building a formal case for their recruitment operation. Thomas understood that accepting even this innocent information would create leverage the Americans could use to pressure him into providing genuinely classified details about palace operations and British government communications. His military training had taught him to recognize the classic progression of intelligence recruitment operations where targets were gradually compromised through seemingly innocent requests that created psychological and legal obligations before handlers extracted genuinely valuable intelligence. Morrison's approach followed this pattern with textbook precision, suggesting extensive planning and professional oversight. Thomas opened a secure notebook he kept locked in his bedroom desk and began documenting every detail of his interactions with Morrison. He recorded dates, times, locations, and the specific information Morrison had requested, along with verbatim quotes from their conversations. His military experience had taught him that accurate documentation could mean the difference between credible intelligence and dismissed suspicions. Each entry included his assessment of Morrison's true objectives and the potential damage that sharing requested information might cause to British security interests. The personal cost of his decision weighed heavily on his mind as he considered what exposing Morrison's operation might trigger. The Americans might attempt retaliation against him or his family, while British authorities might question whether his initial failure to report the contact immediately indicated some level of complicity. His career as a royal guard would certainly face scrutiny and possibly termination if investigators concluded he had handled the situation improperly. But Thomas recognized that the stakes extended far beyond his personal welfare. Morrison's requests for information about NATO communication protocols and emergency response procedures suggested an operation designed to compromise Britain's ability to coordinate with European allies during international crises. The intelligence Morrison sought would allow American officials to understand exactly how British leaders processed and shared sensitive information potentially enabling them to manipulate British decision-making during future diplomatic or military emergencies. His methodical approach to gathering evidence required him to continue meeting with Morrison while secretly working against the operation. Thomas used his position at the palace to observe and document the activities of other Americans who appeared to be working with Morrison's team. He noted their surveillance of palace entrances, their attempts to engage other guards in conversation, and their unusual interest in communication equipment used by palace security. Each observation added another piece to the intelligence picture he was building for British authorities. The moment Thomas made his final choice came during his fifth meeting with Morrison, when the American handler pressed for specific details about the communication systems used to coordinate royal protection during state visits. Morrison explained that understanding these protocols would help American security services provide better protection for their own officials during visits to Britain. But Thomas recognized that such information would actually allow foreign intelligence services to identify vulnerabilities in British security procedures and potentially compromise the safety of the royal family. That evening, Thomas walked to a secure telephone booth near Westminster Bridge and dialed the MI5 code he hoped never to use. He identified himself using the authentication code assigned to royal guards and requested an urgent meeting with a counterintelligence officer. The voice that answered asked no questions but instructed him to report to a specific address in Vauxhall the following morning at precisely 8:30. The weight of responsibility Thomas accepted by making this call extended beyond protecting classified information. He understood that his intelligence might trigger investigations that could damage diplomatic relationships between Britain and America if handled improperly. But his military experience had taught him that loyalty to genuine allies required honest communication about threats, even when such honesty created temporary friction. True partnership demanded the courage to address problems directly rather than allowing them to fester until they caused irreparable damage. Thomas continued his scheduled meetings with Morrison for 3 more days after contacting MI5 following instructions from British intelligence officers who wanted to document the full scope of the American operation. He maintained his outward composure while secretly recording conversations and observing Morrison's reactions to carefully crafted responses designed to reveal the true extent of his intelligence requirements. He continued meeting Morrison, but now every word was being recorded for one purpose: to bring down what investigators would soon discover was a conspiracy far more extensive than anyone initially suspected. The MI5 safe house in Vauxhall buzzed with activity as counterintelligence officers processed Thomas's documentation and began mapping what they initially assumed was a simple recruitment operation. Within hours of reviewing his detailed notes and recorded conversations, they realized they were dealing with something far more sophisticated than routine intelligence gathering. The evidence Thomas had collected revealed coordinated attempts to penetrate British government institutions at multiple levels, suggesting an operation that had been planned for months rather than weeks. 3 discoveries shocked investigators most as they unraveled the conspiracy's true scope. Technical surveillance teams deployed to monitor Vance's remaining activities in London discovered encrypted communication equipment in his hotel suite that violated diplomatic protocols governing foreign government officials. The sophisticated gear included satellite uplinks capable of bypassing British telecommunications infrastructure, entirely allowing direct communication with Washington without British intelligence services monitoring the traffic. This discovery proved that Vance's team had come prepared for operational activities that went far beyond legitimate diplomatic engagement. Financial investigators tracking monetary flows connected to Vance's London visit uncovered a series of offshore accounts funding activities that never appeared in official diplomatic budgets. The money trail led through shell companies registered in Caribbean tax havens to British consulting firms that had been hired to provide what their contracts described as cultural orientation services. But the actual work these firms performed involved detailed research into British government personnel, their personal finances, and their potential vulnerabilities to foreign influence. The revelation that provided the smoking gun came when investigators discovered Vance had secretly met with 3 members of Parliament who served on the Defense Select Committee. These meetings occurred in private dining rooms at exclusive London clubs, where recording devices were prohibited and guest lists remained confidential. The MPs later claimed they believed they were attending routine social gatherings with an American ally, but phone records revealed they had received detailed briefing materials about NATO budget allocations and British military procurement decisions before each meeting. From shell companies to secret dinners to planted journalists, Vance's web extended into every corner of British power. Defense contractor executives who had attended his private dinners were found to have provided detailed assessments of British military capabilities and procurement priorities that went far beyond information available through public channels. Media figures who had been cultivated by his team included prominent journalists specializing in defense and international affairs, who had received exclusive access to American military exercises and classified briefings in exchange for favorable coverage of policies that aligned with Vance's vision of reduced multilateral cooperation. Intelligence analysts realized they were mapping an influence operation designed to create a coalition of British politicians, business leaders, and opinion makers who would advocate for policies that served Vance's political ambitions while weakening Britain's traditional alliances. The strategy appeared designed to demonstrate to American voters that Vance possessed the international credibility and connections necessary for higher office by showing he could manipulate British policy decisions to favor American interests over European cooperation. But the most disturbing discovery revealed Vance's ultimate objective. Investigators realized that his operation included attempts to bypass NATO protocols entirely by establishing direct communication channels between selected British and American officials. These back-channel arrangements would have allowed coordinated policy decisions without consulting European allies, effectively undermining the collective decision-making processes that formed the foundation of the Atlantic Alliance. Surveillance teams monitoring Vance's movements discovered he had made unauthorized visits to British military installations using credentials that suggested coordination with sympathetic officials inside the Ministry of Defense, providing him with detailed knowledge of NATO information sharing procedures. The scope of Vance's network threatened to compromise British sovereignty by creating a shadow influence structure that could manipulate government decisions to serve American political interests rather than British national security requirements, senior analyst Sarah Crawford spread. Surveillance photographs across the conference table showing Morrison meeting with individuals whose faces appeared in MI5 databases as persons of interest. The images revealed a network that extended far beyond a single handler and his target encompassing the very foundations of British democratic institutions. With this proof, MI5 had everything they needed. What happened next would transform a secret investigation into a very public reckoning. The first crack in Vance's carefully constructed facade appeared at 7:30 on a Wednesday morning when The Guardian published an exclusive investigation titled "American Senator's Secret Intelligence Operation in London." The story detailed his unauthorized meetings with Defense Select Committee members, his recruitment attempts targeting palace security personnel, and his use of encrypted communication equipment that violated diplomatic protocols. Within minutes, news alerts flooded smartphones across Britain and America as editors scrambled to match the explosive revelations that threatened to reshape transatlantic relations. Vance's desperate damage control efforts began before breakfast as his communications team flooded American media outlets with statements dismissing the allegations as misunderstandings blown out of proportion by sensationalist British journalism. They claimed his meetings with British officials represented routine diplomatic engagement designed to strengthen the special relationship between longtime allies. His press secretary insisted that any intelligence gathering activities were authorized through proper channels and served legitimate national security interests rather than personal political ambitions. But each hour brought fresh revelations that demolished his defensive narrative. The Times of London published transcripts of recorded conversations between Morrison and Thomas, revealing the specific classified information Vance's team had sought from Buckingham Palace. Major U.S. networks confirmed the existence of congressional emails discussing plans to bypass NATO protocols, while CNN obtained copies of the encrypted communication equipment found in Vance's hotel suite. The story dominated American news cycles as reporters scrambled to understand how a vice presidential hopeful had become embroiled in what intelligence experts described as an espionage scandal. The diplomatic hammer fell at exactly noon London time when Foreign Secretary James Morrison announced that Senator J.D. Vance had been declared persona non grata in the United Kingdom effective immediately. The formal declaration barred him from entering British territory and participating in any official diplomatic activities, ending his ability to conduct the kind of international engagement that presidential candidates required to demonstrate foreign policy credentials. Morrison's statement emphasized that Britain valued its partnership with America, but could not tolerate activities that threatened British sovereignty or NATO cooperation. The collapse of Vance's vice presidential ambitions accelerated as polling data revealed the devastating impact of the scandal on his standing with American voters. Independent polls showed his favorability ratings plummeting from 62% to 28% within a single week as Americans absorbed the implications of his unauthorized intelligence activities. Republican primary voters who had viewed him as a strong candidate for higher office began questioning whether his judgment and temperament suited him for positions requiring international diplomacy and national security oversight. Political allies who had enthusiastically supported Vance's presidential ambitions suddenly discovered urgent scheduling conflicts that prevented them from appearing at campaign events or making public statements in his defense. Major donors canceled fundraising commitments, while influential conservative commentators who had praised his foreign policy expertise began calling for investigations into his London activities. The Republican establishment that had once embraced him as a rising star now treated him as a liability that threatened the party's credibility on national security issues. Congressional committees swiftly opened probes, subpoenaing documents and testimony from Vance and his staff, while the House Intelligence Committee launched its own inquiry into potential security breaches resulting from his intelligence-gathering operations. The investigations promised to expose additional details about his network of contacts and the classified information his team had sought from British sources. The ripple effects extended beyond Vance himself, as investigators identified other American officials who had participated in or supported his London operation. Defense contractors who had shared classified information during his private dinners faced federal investigations, while journalists who had received exclusive access in exchange for favorable coverage found their credibility questioned by colleagues and audiences. The scandal created a climate of suspicion around anyone who had maintained contact with Vance's team during his time in London. Within 30 days, he had been declared persona non grata by Britain, lost his vice presidential prospects, faced congressional investigations, and watched his political influence evaporate as allies abandoned him and donors withdrew their support. All this crumbled around Vance thanks to a guard who refused to stay silent. But what recognition does a hero receive when his heroism must remain secret? Thomas returned to his position at Buckingham Palace 3 weeks later as if nothing had changed. His red uniform displayed the same immaculate creases, his posture maintained the same unwavering discipline, and his eyes held the same steady focus that tourists had admired for 8 years. The crowds gathering behind the iron railings photographed him with renewed interest, having read newspaper accounts of unnamed palace security personnel who had exposed Senator Vance's operation, but they could never identify the hero standing motionless before them. The acknowledgement Thomas received came through channels invisible to public scrutiny. Deputy Director Catherine Mills approached him during his afternoon break wearing civilian clothes and speaking in measured tones that revealed nothing to casual observers but conveyed recognition from the highest levels of British government. 2 days later, he found himself in a windowless room beneath Thames House where senior MI5 officers had gathered for what they called an internal recognition ceremony. The dozen professionals present understood the significance of his contribution to national security. Mills presented Thomas with a simple plaque bearing the inscription that would define his legacy within intelligence circles, "The Guard Who Saved the Gate," a title that would circulate only among those cleared to know the full details of Vance's operation. The ceremony lasted exactly 15 minutes with no speeches. Just quiet acknowledgement from those who understood his actions had prevented a breach that could have compromised British sovereignty for years. Multiple offers from MI5 and private firms followed, promising recognition, advancement, and salaries worth 5 times his Royal Guard pay. Government officials wanted to recruit him for executive protection details, while private security companies offered contracts that would have elevated him from ceremonial duties to operational roles within British intelligence services. He declined every offer, choosing the silent sentry over any spotlight. Thomas found purpose in maintaining the facade of simple military discipline while serving as an early warning system against future intelligence operations targeting British institutions. His decision reflected understanding that his greatest value lay not in recognition, but in remaining exactly where foreign operatives would least suspect extraordinary capabilities. His fellow guards noticed subtle changes in how senior palace officials treated Thomas, though they never learned the reasons behind the increased respect. Security briefings now included his input on visitor assessment procedures, while his opinions carried new weight in discussions about potential threats to royal protection protocols. The younger guards studied his methods more carefully, recognizing that his legendary composure masked skills they were only beginning to appreciate. Palace security systems underwent comprehensive upgrades based on vulnerabilities Thomas had identified during his counterintelligence operation. His methods became the blueprint for palace security reforms. New communication protocols prevented unauthorized access to information about guard rotations and visitor procedures, while enhanced screening procedures eliminated the possibility of foreign operatives gathering detailed intelligence about palace operations. These improvements strengthened defenses, not just against future American operations, but against any foreign government that might attempt similar infiltration efforts. The morning routine that had defined Thomas's life for 8 years resumed with one crucial difference. He now carried knowledge that his quiet service had protected institutions far beyond the palace walls and prevented damage to alliances that formed the foundation of Western security cooperation. His motionless vigil represented more than ceremonial tradition. It embodied the principle that democratic institutions survived because individuals chose duty over personal gain, even when such choices brought no public recognition. The tourists who photographed Thomas never understood that they were documenting a man whose quiet courage had preserved freedoms they took for granted. His story illustrated how ordinary citizens in positions of trust could defeat sophisticated threats through simple adherence to principles that made democratic institutions worth protecting. Behind his familiar stillness lay proof that the most important victories often belong to those who would never claim credit for achieving them. Thomas returned to his silent post, proving that heroism lives not in headlines or ceremonies, but in moments when ordinary people choose principle over profit. His story reminds us that democracy's greatest defenders often stand in plain sight, their most crucial victories hidden from those they protect. The tourists who photograph guards at Buckingham Palace never suspect they might be documenting someone whose quiet courage prevented international crisis. Behind every motionless figure in uniform may stand a person who chose duty when temptation offered easier paths. True guardians of freedom serve without recognition, because the cause matters more than credit. If you admire untold stories of unsung service, subscribe and share to honor the silent sentinels among us. Next time you see a guard at attention, what secret duty might they be performing?